Next, we're going to be looking at the bony fishes. So, bony fish belong to class Osteichthyes. Bony fish are what most people think of when they hear the word fish. The term osteo is a prefix, it means bone, and members of this class have endoskeletons that are calcified, so they have what we might consider true bones. Vertebrates, like bony fishes, use cartilage as a connective tissue to hold their true bone skeletons together. And bony fish have calcified vertebrae and skulls, but ribs that are largely cartilage. So 95% of all fish on Earth are bony fish, and bony fish have vertebrae made of bone, hence their name. For looking at the general anatomy of a bony fish, we have to make sure you note its anterior and posterior dorsal fins. It also has a caudal fin, pelvic fin, and pectoral fins. And its lateral line is going to also be able to sense vibration in the water, and is present in most members of this class. Bony fishes use their lateral line to warn them of possible predators. Bony fish also have a cover for their gills called the opercula or operculum. In order to breathe, the fish must open its mouth, draw water into it, then it opens the operculum, and as the water rushes over the gills, dissolved oxygen diffuses into the capillaries of the gills, and then carbon dioxide diffuses out of the gill capillaries and into the water. This process is so efficient that 80% of the oxygen in water can be absorbed in just one pass. So again, let's look at that base anatomy for the fins. We have an anterior and posterior dorsal fin, caudal fin essentially at the tail, an anal fin, and pelvic fin. The pelvic fins are going to be near the pectoral fins, which are also paired, and there would be another pectoral fin on the opposite side. We can also see here its head and its tail. Near its head is the operculum, or cover for the gills, and here you can see this dark line that's just barely visible, but that goes along the length of the fish, and that is its lateral line. The dorsal fins of bony fish are larger than a shark's. Compared really to their body mass, they are way too large. But it's because bony fish rely on their dorsal fins for balance. And since they have flatter bodies, they need balance. The anterior dorsal fin of many bony fishes have sharp spines, and the spines act as a defense against predators. Scales on a bony fish also exist, and they overlap. There are special glands beneath these scales that secrete a mucus, and that gives the fish a slimy feel. But the mucus is waterproofing. It protects the fish from parasites, and it makes the fish more mobile in the water. Now let's look at the internal anatomy of a bony fish. When a fish feeds, it is going to have food travel into its mouth, then it goes across its tongue. Their tongue is lined with taste buds, and taste buds are receptors that send signals to the brain, providing the fish with a sense of taste. Food then travels to the muscular pharynx, or the throat, then the esophagus, and the esophagus leads to the stomach. Food then is broken down and stored in the stomach until it needs to be digested. When the food needs to be digested, it moves into the intestines, where it is digested. Any undigested food leaves the fish through the anus. The fish also has two organs that aid the intestines in digestion. The pyloric ceca secretes some digestive enzymes into the intestine and the stomach to aid in digestion. Then the liver, which is connected to the small intestine, secretes bile to the gallbladder. Bile is a mixture of salts and phospholipids that aid in the breakdown of fat. Bile helps break down fat, especially when it is concentrated in the gallbladder. It becomes better at doing its job. So let's look at some of that base anatomy. So we can go through the digestive tract. We start at the mouth, and we're going to move into the pharynx, which is near the gills. And then from there, we're going to move into the esophagus, next the stomach, and then into the intestines. Branches off the first part of the intestines are the pyloric cecae. Here also we can see the anus that exit out the end or near the caudal tails. Something we can't see on the right image is the liver. The liver would be close to the pyloric cecae, and it's going to produce bile and send it to the gallbladder. The liver actually does more than just secrete bile to the gallbladder. The liver is also important in converting nutrients from one form to another. It changes monosaccharides, such as fructose, to glucose, which is what the cells would prefer to use for energy. The liver can also combine nutrients into more useful chemicals, like phospholipids. They are, for example, produced from fats and other chemicals absorbed during the digestive process. The liver also cleans the blood using phagocytes to remove dead blood cells, bacteria, and other debris from the blood. It's oftentimes a detoxifying organ in many vertebrates. The liver also can convert ammonia to urea. Ammonia is a metabolic waste that body cells produce, and it's toxic. Urea is not nearly as toxic to tissues, and it leaves the blood in urine. We can also look at the air bladder that bony fish have. An air bladder helps a fish stay afloat in the water. Bony fish can direct gases from their blood and digestive system to and from their air bladder. Adding gases to the air bladder increases their buoyancy and usually allows them to rise in the water column. Releasing gases from the air bladder decreases their buoyancy and usually allows them to fall in the water column. Bony fish also have a reproductive system, and essentially they have two separate sexes. The gonads of the male fish is its testes, while the gonads of a female fish is its ovaries. Most bony fish are oviparous, where the female lays eggs and then the male covers them with milt. Milt is a fluid that contains sperm. Fertilization is therefore external in most bony fish, and eggs are then left to develop and hatch. When the female lays eggs, we usually say she is spawning. When we're looking at a circulatory system in bony fish, we can look specifically at a closed circulatory system. A closed circulatory system that has one loop, but does begin with a two-chambered heart. The two-chambered heart has two separate sections, one called the atrium and the other the ventricle. The atrium is the receiving chamber, whereas the ventricle is the pumping chamber, and the atrium receives blood from veins that bring blood back to the heart. The blood then moves into the ventricle, and the ventricle pumps blood out again. While the ventricle is pumping, the atrium is filling again, waiting for the next chance to empty into the ventricle. The blood leaves the heart through a large blood vessel called a ventral aorta, and that branches into smaller vessels called afferent brachial arteries. These arteries supply blood to the capillaries in the gills, where carbon dioxide is released and oxygen is absorbed. Now that the blood is oxygen rich, it leaves the gills through the efferent brachial arteries, and these arteries dump blood into the dorsal aorta. Some of the blood travels from the dorsal aorta to the head and other cranial cells, and that provides nutrients and oxygen to tissues in that region. And once the blood is oxygen poor, it is carried back to the heart in the anterior cardial vein. Some of the blood travels, however, to the rest of the body, such as past the intestines. There, nutrients and cell waste are absorbed into the blood, and that blood then passes through the kidneys and is filtered. It rids it of its waste products, and then once it has done its job, it is carried back to the heart, the blood is, by the posterior cardial vein, where the process starts again. So there are a lot of different names for the blood vessels in fish. They can vary depending on the species, but let's look at the basic outline. We have a two-chambered heart, an atrium and a ventricle exist within that heart. Blood is always going to leave the heart after being pumped by the ventricle into circulation. It leaves the heart in an artery. It goes to the gill capillaries. It gets oxygen. That blood comes back eventually to the heart, but only after passing through the systemic circulation or to the tissues where it gives away its oxygen. And then a vein is going to lead it back to the atrium so we can cycle this again. Here you can see the major vascularization of the gills. They have a lot of small capillaries that allow for gas exchange. You can also see the arrangement of the dorsal and ventral blood vessels that help movement of blood in the fish. So here is an image of the basic circulatory system in a fish. And again, you can see the heart right in this region. You have the atrium and the ventricle. Here's the ventral aorta that we talked about, that the ventricle pumps into, which will then be taken to the gills via the afferent brachial arteries, and then will drain from the gills using the efferent brachial arteries and travel down the dorsal aorta. From the dorsal aorta, it will enter the kidneys as well as go to other places that are past the tail in order to give oxygen to those tissues, but essentially does cycle back towards the kidneys regardless. And then that blood can travel after going through the posterior cardial vein back to the heart. And fish are one of the only vertebrates that have a single circulatory system. Most vertebrates, like amphibians and mammals and birds, have a double circulation. Fish are also ectothermic. They lack an internal mechanism for regulating their body heat, so they're oftentimes termed cold blooded. Therefore, though, they're very sensitive to the temperature of the water in which they live. We can also look at their fins. Here's a ray fin and here's a lobed fin. And there does exist within osteichthyes ray finned fishes and lobe finned fishes. And even though there's over 28,000 living species that belong to this class, osteichthyes, we still can further divide it. Lobe finned fish, like the coelacanth, you can see here on the right, and they do have fish fins that kind of look like rudimentary legs. Their low finned areas are fleshy fins and they're supported by substantial support bones, and they may not be as maneuverable as the ray fins, but they can definitely support more weight. Ray finned fishes have fins made of slender bones, and they can even be called spines or rays, and they connect to a thin covering of skin. Ray fin fishes are probably the ones you're more familiar with if I say bony fish, like the puffer fish or a bass, or even a piranha. Here are some examples of different types of fish. Here's the carp, oftentimes called a trash fish. It scavenges the bottom of bodies of water for vegetative debris and decaying matter. It eats eggs, algae, plants, worms, snails, mussels, many other animals, pretty much whatever it can come into contact with. Now, it can live in water that's too polluted for other species, so it can be invasive. It's very bony, hard to eat, but it can replace indigenous fish species by stirring up mud and vegetation constantly to essentially drive competition out of a region. And the ornamental carp are also called koi, and they're often kept in ponds because of their many colors. There's also the salmon. An Atlantic salmon is very common, especially in restaurants as a food item. It lives in adult life primarily in cold water of the Atlantic Ocean, but in the late spring or early summer it travels back to the cold, swiftly flowing freshwater stream in which it was born, and that's in order to reproduce. Because of this type of life cycle, salmon are known as anadromous. Anadromous refers to a life cycle in which creatures are hatched in freshwater, migrate to saltwater as adults, and then go back to freshwater in order to reproduce. So here we can see on the right fish trying to get back to the area from which they were spawned. And these fish, of course, are salmon, and they use the abundant muscle they have in order to propel them essentially upriver. You can see some of that muscle in the filleted salmon on the left. Betta fish are also known as the Siamese fighting fish, very common aquarium fish, and they're from the freshwaters of Southeast Asia. They are aggressive toward other betta fish, especially the males. They do coexist well, though, with other fish. And then here's a marine fish example, the lionfish. It has bright colors and it has specialized cells called chromatophores that produce those bright colors. Chromatophores produce pigments that give the fish its unique color. The lionfish's colors are meant as a warning, however. They have enlarged pectoral fins that are tipped with venomous glands. You can see them on its back. The venom of the lionfish can be deadly even to humans. And then here is the spiny puffer. Here it is puffed up. The spiny puffer, though, is harmful looking most of the time. It has a beak like mouth for eating mollusks and coral, and it really only puffs up like this when it feels threatened. It is a delicacy in many Asian countries, but the flesh of a puffer fish can be deadly if not prepared properly because of the poisonous glands it contains near its meat. Then here's the butterfly fish that uses chromophores in its posterior or back region, and it's using those chromophores to produce a very dark pigment. They're arranged in large discs or circles to give the visual impression of a large eye. Some fish think that this large eye means the butterfly fish is a large predator fish, and as a result, they stay away. But fish that are not scared of another predator fish still tend to attack the back of the butterfly fish, but that gives it a better chance of getting away. Next, we're going to look at a basic perch dissection. This is a fish dissection. All right, here we can see, because of a lateral cross section of the fish, a lot of its GI tract or alimentary canal. For example, here is its stomach near the pyloric cecum. Nearby is its pancreas, We also have more of its intestine down here. And then you can also see a little bit of its urinary bladder, its gonads, swim bladder. Up here is its heart, as well as some of its vasculature near the gills. Here's the cover for the gills, the operculum. The eye is up here. It does have a mandible. It is a jawed fish. All bony fish have a jaw. This is also its mouth. You can see some of its dorsal fins, the spines that make it a ray-finned fish. We can see the remnant here of the lateral line. Here's a caudal fin, an anal fin, and here is a pelvic fin. Here is an up-close view of some of the structures that we haven't seen and some that we have. Mouth, nostrils, eye, operculum, broken because it's a cover to reveal the gill slits below, heart, liver, gastric ceca. In the previous image, the liver was dissected out so we could see other parts of the fish's GI tract, like the stomach, which would be under the gastric ceca in the liver. Spleen, which would be inside, it's this kind of darker color here. Intestine again ends up being more ventral or towards the belly. Oftentimes, the first part of the intestine is called the duodenum. Here we can also see the gas bladder, another name for the air bladder. And here is the ovary or the gonads, which makes this a female. Here we've pulled back the liver. There's the gastric ceca, that's the liver. There's the air bladder, kidney is these small structures. In here, ovary, usually a sac to contain eggs. Spleen, that dark area I pointed to before. Intestine towards the stomach. Intestine does proceed after the stomach, heart up here. So most of these structures we've seen. And then here's a better look at its eye. Its operculum. Here we have dissected that sac. You can actually see the individual eggs of the ovary. Better look at the gills without them being completely dissected out. And here is the liver. This is the underside. Here is its esophagus open. You can see all of these kind of grooves that would help move food down. Testes in a male fish also just looks like a sac when undissected. More gill slits, oral cavity. So now we're looking at its mouth. So these grooves essentially are leading into its mouth. Gastric ceca, again, are very finger-like and really help with digestion and absorption. And that looks like about it. So those are most of the structures we've been talking about that we would see in a fish.